Hello, this is Botany and Plant Sciences 031 Spring Wildflowers. This is the lecture, uh, the third lecture of week 7 of our course that corresponds to Friday, May 15th, year 2020. And we will discuss today a very interesting family, the family Cactaceae, the cactus family. So let me start moving on to the slides, share screen, and we'll see some fun slides about cacti. Uh, as you probably all intuitively know, uh, you people normally recognize cacti because they have green stems. Sometimes they're flat, like in this case, it's a prickly pear. This is Opuntia littoralis from California. They have green stems. They have spines in whorls, in small fascicles or whorls on the stems. And the flowers are normally very showy and very beautiful. If you look in more detail at the stem, you will see that these whorls of spines come from a little elevation in the stem. This is a cross section of the cuticle of the stem. There's a little elevation, and the spines grow in those elevations. In some cacti, the elevations are very pronounced, and they're known as tubercles, also known as nipples or mamillae in Latin. So cacti have these little elevations full of spines that defend the stem. They normally have no leaves, or if they do have leaves, they're very small vestigial leaves turned into spines. So really, from the perspective of the stem morphology, what you have is this green section here is a stem, and each of these whorls of spines is an axillary bud, and initially when the stem forms, it has a leaf that subtends the spine. So really, the typical plant metamere formation of leaves, nodes, internodes, and axillary buds is respected and is maintained in the family Cactaceae. Each of the epidermal elevations, the tubercles, are really nodes along the stem. So these plants formed during the last 5 million years, a period known as the Pliocene and first, and then Pleistocene in the last 2 million years, in which the Earth in general underwent increasing aridization. The great deserts of the world formed during these last 5 million years. And cacti gradually adapted to increased aridization by having more and more reduced leaves and transforming, like in many other desert plants, transforming their leaves first into rigid bracts, and then the bracts into spines, which are really, the spines in cacti are really transformed bracts. The flowers are very, very distinctive in cacti, and there's no way you can confuse it with any other family. The ovary, drawn here, has parietal placentation inside the ovary, and multiple seeds, in some fruits, hundreds, in some thousands of seeds inside the fruit. And the stem itself that supports the flower grows around it. The receptacle of the flower grows around the ovary, forming a very large fleshy hypanthium, like in the family Rosaceae. So the ovary is inferior. It's surrounded by a hypanthium that is formed by an enlargement of the subtending stem. And as such, the fruits on the outside normally have areoles, which are really axillary bracts. So you can see, actually, by looking at the fruit from outside, that it's part of the stem. And then here on top, it has a cone-sized receptacle with a series of tepals, and not petals or sepals properly. They start as sepaloid structures, green bracts that look leafy, and then they go gradually changing into less leafy and more petaloid structure until the last petals before the stamens appear are large and colorful. But they do not have two clearly distinguished whorls of sepals and petals. They start with sepaloid um, bracts that gradually turn into petaloid bracts, into showy bracts. Um, the, the stamens are many. By many, I mean seriously many, normally uh, many dozens or sometimes even hundreds of stamens. Uh, Frequently showy, nice. They have the filament is often colored or creamy colored, but nice and showy. And in the middle of the stamens, you will see the style coming up, and then the stigma. The stigma is normally lobed or divided um, because it reflects the number of bracts, the number of carpels, sorry, that form the ovary. The ovary is formed by a number of carpels, can be 5, 6, 10, and you can know how many carpels form the ovary by counting at the branches of the stigma. The stigma is normally segmented or branched. Let us see some photos to get a better idea of oh, sorry, before we get into photos of the plants, the distribution. This is a fascinating story. Cacti, although now they're cultivated all over the world because people really go, amateur gardeners go bonkers for cacti, they're only distributed in the Americas. They grow all the way from Canada all the way to Patagonia, although they're really abundant in the deserts of North and in the deserts of South America. North and South America, very common and abundant also in the drier islands of the Caribbean because they are adapted to arid climates. But they evolved, the whole family evolved in the American continent and crossed the Central American land bridge. So it's a new world family. It doesn't exist at all outside the Americas. Africa, Europe, or Asia, or Australia do not have native cacti. It's only native to the Americas. So we saw this at the beginning when we were seeing stem morphology. One of the questions that some people have asked is how do these bizarre growth forms like a saguaro? You know, tourists come from all over the world to Arizona to see saguaros. If we have lived in the region or we've seen them many times, they might look like normal plants for us. But really, people make pilgrimages to see the giant cactus because they're nowhere else in the world to be seen. Really, the ancestors of cacti are these plants here from the tropics, known with the genus Pereschia. This is Pereschia grandiflora, the most common Pereschia in the tropics. It goes all the way from southern Mexico to Brazil and Paraguay and Bolivia. Even in parts of northern Argentina, you'll find it's a tropical plant all over the Americas in the tropics. You see, it has normal leaves and it does have spines in the axillary buds. Some of the bracts in the axillary buds in the world are transformed into spines that protect the plant from herbivores. The flower is like any cactus flower, it's large and showy, and you can see the transition from leaf-like sepals to pink large petals changing gradually. It doesn't have two whorls of sepals and petals. So a student of mine did a study of these plants, asking how did this become a saguaro? And following the rules of plant architecture that we saw in the first week of class about the plant metamere, she played with two variables really, internode length So making the stems, the internode length shorter and shorter, and leaf size, reducing the leaves and turning them into spines. And you can see a normal plant with long internodes, if you start reducing the internode and also reducing the leaves, we start acquiring very rapidly the shape of a cactus, like a cholla cactus, or even if the angle of formation varies a little, like the saguaro cactus with ribs. So really, although they might look completely different from a normal dicotyledon leafy plant, really they are extremely transformed, but they follow the same architectural rules of metamere formation of node, internode leaves, and axillary buds that any other plant follows. They're not an exception, although they might look bizarre. I mean, when you see these plants in the field, the areoles are so compact, the stem is so compact that it looks like it belongs in a completely different kingdom, as a matter of fact. Some people will cultivate them because they believe they look like underwater organisms, like corals or anemones or medusas or something like that, but they're really dicotyledon plants. There, again, there are some cacti that grow in the tropics and the genus Pereschia that you would normally not even recognize them if you saw them without looking at the flower. If you didn't see the flower, you wouldn't even recognize them as a cactus. Most cacti, when they germinate, they are dicotyledon, so they have two cotyledons, but they're fleshy and plump and succulent from their germination. This is a seedling of a cactus. You can see the first cotyledon, the second cotyledon, and then the areoles that start forming. Let's have a look at the areoles themselves. Many cacti, especially the prickly pears that you see so commonly planted throughout Southern California and our region, in the areoles are axillary buds. You can see it here. This is the leaf. This structure here is a leaf, very reduced, but they will have a leaf. And then they have an axillary bud, and the leaves in the axillary bud are transformed into spines. You see, even the main leaf is spine-like, although it's green and soft. It's not prickly in most cacti, but you have leaves subtending an axil with transformed leaves that are spines. That is what gives origin to the areoles. But areoles very often have these powdery little structures here that look like velvet hairs, if you look at them. Those, if you put in the microscope, they have this structure here. They're known as glochids. You can see they're hairs with little retrors, microscopic retror spines in the hair. And if you touch them, they get under your skin. This is the tip. And once they get under your skin, it's a whale harpoon. You can't get it out because the retrors spines here will open and prevent getting them out. Eventually, your body, your immune system will get rid of them, very often by making a little ball of pus and suppuration and making it leave. But they're nasty little things. Glochids can be nasty. And that really exemplifies the effort that cacti have made in evolution to defend themselves from predators. Why are they so formidably defended? It has to do with the fact that these plants evolved to survive in desert environments by storing water in the stems. They're succulent. The stem stores water. And of course, storing water in a dry season doesn't seem, in a desert, doesn't seem like a good idea because most animals will want to eat that water stored. One might to eat that green tissue. So cacti defend themselves with spines to prevent from being eaten. As you can see in many of these plants, these are the areoles in Coryphantha, known as a cushion cactus. And you can see the multiplicity of spines in each of the tubercles or elevations. This is a prickly pear. We have a number of prickly pears in California. This is a Puncia macrorhiza. A number of things that you can see. The areoles with white leaves, and if you look closely, it will have glochids, also the microscopic spines that are so nasty. You can see here in the stem the first leaf. The first leaf is indeed a green photosynthetic leaf. It's still a quote-unquote memory of the origin of the group. That is very rapidly shed, and the only thing that remains are the spiny areoles. The flower making a transition from sepals to petals without discontinuity. It's not two worlds, it's only one world. Multiplicity of stamens. The nectar glands are right down here where the stigma becomes inserted into the ovary. So an insect trying to get here to get the nectar will have to fight its way along this well around the style, trying to get to the nectar, and will get completely full of pollen from this plant. But before doing so, it will hit the stigma and leave the pollen from the previous flower. You can see that the stigma is fragmented, is divided in branches, because it reflects the number of carpels that form the ovule. And you can see the ovule has no divisions. The placentation is parietal. And this part here is the ovule. The rest of the green stuff here is the hypanthium of the plant. And you can see that it is a stem because it has axillary buds, it has areoles. Opuntia fruits are very cherished in many parts of the world. In Mexico, they're eating in large amounts. In South America and Peru, they're also consumed in large numbers. And in Europe, they're very much in vogue now. In many countries in Europe, you will even find them in Scandinavia. And they're not cultivated in Europe. Most of the prickly pear fruits are cultivated in the Canary Islands. Apart from the fruit and the pads are known as nopales in Mexico, and they're very nice to eat. The new pads of the year, you can cut them and eat them in salad. So cacti make, as a matter of fact, prickly pear pads, the stems of the prickly pears make an amazing amount of the vegetables consumed in central Mexico nowadays, and also in many other countries. Even in Asia, there's a growing interest for the consumption of cactus green pads. But for many centuries, as a matter of fact, there is an insect known as a coccineal bug. It's an hemipteran, it's a scale, it's an insect that attaches itself to the cactus. And if you remove the insect that is attached to the pads and dry them, it has like a hemoglobin. It has the lymph of the insect is deep red, and it's an amazing dye to dye things red. As a matter of fact, during the Spanish colony, the export of coccineal dye, of dried coccineal dye to Europe was, during some years, for a number of centuries, as a matter of fact, competed with gold and silver as the main export, giving money to the Spanish crown from the colonies, because coccineal dye replaced purpura that was obtained in Europe from a snail, a marine snail in the Mediterranean. Coccineal dye was cheaper, and it was very, very liked by royalty in Europe. The bishops wore red, the Cassacks of army officers of all the armies wear red, the kings loved wearing red garments also. So red garments were a symbol of royalty and privilege. And that was mostly for between the 1550 and around 1900, when Germans invented aniline dyes and killed completely the industry of natural dyes throughout the world. Red dye during 4 centuries was obtained from coccineal dye in Mexico in general, particularly in Oaxaca, that made a lot of its income and its money by selling coccineal dye to Europe. You will see here some other flowers. The Christmas cactus, that you see it a lot being sold in uh, markets and greenhouses and nurseries for Christmas, the flowers are always the same. Areoles around in the hypantium around the ovary, inferior ovary with parietal placentation, the filaments of the stamens, and of course, always the stigmas marking the number of carpels. In this case, you can count them: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 carpels. So you can count the number of carpels by looking at the flowers of the cacti. Some cacti have smaller flowers in the Chihuahua Desert, all the way to New Mexico. Cacti have relatively small flowers. For example, peyote cactus, Lophophora williamsi, that is so much used by many of our native tribes for ceremonial occasions. It's highly hallucinogenic. It's a fairly inconspicuous flowers, but then there's a group of night blooming cacti, normally white, in the tropical rainforest. And I'll talk in a second about cacti growing in a wet rainforest. What are they doing there? The flowers are huge, are white, and they're normally pollinated by bats. Every time you see these large white flowers in the tropics, that plant is normally pollinated by bats. And you will see that many of these flowers, known as Chiropterophilus flowers, Chiroptera meaning bat, many of these flowers open at night and become fragrant at night, and then they close in the morning. Here we have another night blooming cactus. You can see the flowers. They're almost, the sexual parts fall below, so they're slightly zygomorphic. They're not entirely zygomorphic, but almost slightly zygomorphic. Rhipsalis baxifera is an epiphyte. It grows with orchids in the Amazon, the wettest part of the Amazon rainforest, and it's a cactus. If you look at the flower, it's a cactus. Has almost no spines, although it doesn't have leaves. It does, like a proper cactus, it does photosynthesis with its stem, but it's gone back. Imagine the evolutionary trait. It originated from a Pereschia, and then it became a desert plant, and then it sort of evolved again, occupying a niche in the tropical rainforest, becoming a tropical epiphyte. They live on other plants. As we'll see in a second when we see the photosynthesis of cactus, there's a reason why they do so well. In the Galapagos Islands, there's a prickly pear, Opuntia equiops, that is really interesting because of the giant tortoises in the Galapagos. It grows as quickly as it can to a certain size, so it becomes tree-like, so it's not eaten, it can survive the foraging of the Galapagos tortoises. Okay, physiology. This is not a course about physiology, so I'm going to be very gentle, but there's something that is very important. Cacti have one trait that makes them quite unique in the plant kingdom, which is they divide the photosynthesis process into a daytime process and a nighttime process. And let me explain this a little. You know, photosynthesis, we discussed it in class, is a mechanism through which plants capture the energy of solar contained in visible solar radiation, transform it into chemical bonds, and then they open their stomata and capture CO2 from the air. They're constantly scrubbing CO2 out of the air and convert the CO2 into sugars, into carbohydrates. And then that is used as the building mechanism for all other organic molecules in the plants. So photosynthesis has two processes. One is the capturing of solar radiation into chemical bonds. And the second one is the opening of the stomata to bring in CO2 and convert the CO2 with chemical energy into carbohydrates by reducing the CO2, which is an oxidized form of carbon, into a carbohydrate, into a reduced form of carbon chains. Okay, cacti can do that separately. During the day, they are capturing sunlight, basically, but their stomata are closed. They're not opening their stomata. And that's one of the reasons why they're so fat, they're plump, because they have to have large vacuoles in the cells to accumulate in the form of chemical bonds, normally adenosine triphosphate, uh, in the form of chemical bonds. They can store the energy captured from the sun. And then at night, when it's cooler and evaporation is much, much lower because there is no solar radiation, they open the stomata and they bring in the CO2 and convert it into sugars. So they store energy during the day and they capture and store CO2 during the night. They have the two functions separated. And that's amazing because that allows them to survive very, very well in a desert environment. They actually open their stomata at a time of the day, or I should say a time of the night, when the evaporation demand is very low, and they're able to be incredibly efficient in the use of water. As a matter of fact, cacti in general, can make the same amount of organic matter, like say, if you see a cactus fruit and compare it with an apple or a peach, the cactus plant has used sometimes 10 or even 20 times less water to form that fruit compared to the standard fruit production in, say, a rosaceous plant, an apple or a peach. But that also brings me back to the tropical rainforest cacti. During the day, all plants in the tropical rainforest are doing photosynthesis and capturing CO2. So there is very little CO2 in the tropical rainforest. During the night, plants have ceased to do photosynthesis. They're not capturing CO2, but all the plants are still breathing and they're exhaling CO2. So there's a lot of CO2 in the air under the canopy in the tropical rainforest. So many of these tropical rainforest cacti live in the tropical rainforest not because they are water efficient, because you don't need a lot of water efficiency to survive in a rainforest. It rains all the time, but they're very good and competitive there because they can harvest CO2 during the night when there's plenty of CO2, and they can grow quite well. As a matter of fact, tropical rainforest epiphytes can grow much faster than orchids or bromeliads, just to give two examples. So let us go now to another trait of cacti, which is known as the nurse plant effect. You will often see, if you go to the California deserts or to the Arizona desert, you will very often see that the young saguaros are growing associated to a tree, in this case, a palo verde, sometimes a mesquite. And this is something that has intrigued scientists for a long time. Why do cacti grow in association with a tree? And that is known as the nurse plant effect. You'll see it over and over again. Once a cactus is large, it's adult, you don't see it growing in association with a tree. But when it's young, almost invariably, it's growing under the canopy or near the canopy of a tree. The reason why they have these nurse plants is because cacti cannot transpire during the day and they cannot control temperature. So they're likely to die in the open soil desert, especially when they're little seedlings. So the only way they can survive is by germinating under the shade of a plant that will give them shade protection and grow in association with the shade of that plant. Those plants are known as nurse plants, and it's mostly palo verdes and mesquites are some of the most important nurse plants. Once a cactus reaches a certain height, it escapes the high temperature of the ground level and it can start growing well and capturing water. And they're so good at capturing water that they actually eventually will kill the nurse plant. This is a cycle that takes over a century to happen completely. But eventually, after many decades, the cactus will eventually kill the very plant that allowed it to germinate and grow. It's a fascinating phenomenon that makes you think about a lot of things in Freudian psychology, the killing of the nurse in order to survive. Anyway, it's a fun story, and it has to do with the complicated mechanisms in the desert. Other things you will see, and you will see it in the botanical gardens, many cacti have these hairy structures in the apical bud where the flowers, the tender tissues of flowers and the top meristem are. And these tissues really are isolating tissue, insulating tissues. They provide a separation between the tender stem cells in the center of the cactus, in the central bud, and in the flowers from the heat of midday. They self-shade the plant. Many cacti have these self-shading mechanisms in the tip of their stems, and they're known as cephalia, in Latin meaning a head. Very often cacti have cephalia. Sometimes the cephalia is on the side, like this fascinating plant in Oaxaca in southern Mexico that makes the cephalia always facing north. If you're lost in the dry forest, you can know exactly where you are by looking at the orientation of the cephalia. Look here, the north pointing desert. It's quite amazing. I thought these are more examples of cephalia. Serotiny. Serotiny is a technical term we use for a phenomenon known as seed retention. Many plants do not, once they produce the fruit, do not release the fruit into the environment immediately, but can retain it in the tissue of the mother plant for a while and then release it when conditions are right. This beautiful cactus from Puebla in southern Mexico, known as Mammillaria pectinifera, has serotinous fruits. You can also see again the cactus flower morphology with, in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stigmas. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stigmas, indicating that this plant has 5 carpels in the flowers. The flowers will open, will reproduce, but then they will retain the fruit under the spines, very well protected under the shade of these comb-looking spines. Pecten in Latin means comb, that you use to comb your hair. So pectinifera means that looks like a comb. And the fruit will stay there for a year or two until it gets a good rain. And when it gets a good rain, the plant swells with water and extrudes the fruit out. And so these fruits might have been formed 1 or 2 years before the time they're extruded. And the plant will only release them into the environment when conditions are just good. So it's a really interesting phenomenon. Many cacti can do that, can retain the fruits for certain periods of time in the tissue of the maternal plant, and only open and release them into the environment when environmental conditions are good. This is the mechanism how it operates. You can see the flower in Mammillaria forms a fruit, and then when if a good year comes and the fruit has been formed a year before or something, it is expelled outside into the environment. Otherwise, it stays. It can stay for 5, 6, 10 years in the tissue of the mother plant. You can see here old fruits down here, and gradually release seed as the plant ages. So we're almost done with cacti. Let us talk about some California genera. The saguaro. The saguaro is mostly Arizonan, but it does grow in the lower Colorado Valley near from Yuma. Yuma is still Arizona, into the United States, or east of the Salton Sea and the mountains there, you will see some saguaros near the lower part of the Colorado River. The flowers of the saguaro, as you can see by the white, bright color and the tubular shape, are pollinated by bats. The foxtail cactus and the pencil cholla, very common in our deserts. The pencil cholla, very nasty little thing. The teddy bear cholla also, I don't think I have a teddy bear cholla here. The barrel cactus, very common when you cross the mountains from Riverside into the desert. Oh, and back here you have a teddy bear cholla. These are the nastiest things you can imagine. Always the same flower structure. Many petals. In the barrel cactus, the petals are relatively thin. A dense whorl of anthers. And then you can see the many carpels, the many styles that mark the presence of a multitude of carpels. Mammillaria dioica, the strawberry cactus, or the pincushion cactus, very common in our desert mountains. Opuntia basilaris, the beaver tail cactus, very common we would have seen it, would have done the trips this year in both in Swarthmore Canyon and in the Santa Rosa Plateau. It's common throughout chaparral habitat. This is an interesting plant. It has no spines. It only has glochids. Remember, I talked about glochids, these really small microscopic spines. It only has glochids, but it's the nastiest thing you can imagine because they get under your skin and they will give you pain for days on end. Beautiful flowers, are really nice flowers. Oh, here we have the teddy bear cholla that I mentioned, the silver cholla or Poncia echinocarpa, the chollas in general, and last but not least, near our coast in Torrey Pines, near La Jolla, and in some parts of our coast. Most of our coast, unfortunately, is developed, and this plant survives in only a few plant parts. It's Cactus emorii, the velvet cactus, a coastal cactus. You will also see it on the California Channel Islands. It's a beautiful coastal cactus that wherever we keep some remaining part of our coastal scrubs or coastal chaparral or coastal sage scrub, you will see it creeping out and making beautiful formations. And that's all for the cactus family. On Monday, the 18th of May, in class, not in asynchronous lectures. In class, we're going to do a little bit of morphology and dissections of cactus flowers. On the Friday, we're going to repeat this, basically this same lecture and discuss the same lecture during in-person class. So there's going to be some redundancy between both. On Monday, the 18th, you might want to come to class or follow the class because we're going to do some fun dissections of beautiful cactus flowers. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend. Stay safe. We're finishing week 7. We have 3 weeks to go. We're done. We're rapidly approaching the end of the course. Stay safe during the weekend, and I'll see you next week.